Well, Howard and I did the classic talk show pre-interview a couple days ago, and I told him we talked about some of the things that I might ask and some of the things he might want to talk about. But I warned him that I was going to start with a question I wasn't going to tell him about. That was going to be a complete surprise. But I promised.
Have you ever been?
But I promised him he would have an answer. So. You need help with that?
No, I'm not
Good,
this.
okay.
I got this one.
Well, today is November 22nd, 2015, and you are 68 years old.
Yes.
On November 22nd, 1963, you were 16.
Yes.
Where were you and what were you doing?
I was going to bring this up myself. I'm glad you asked this. No, really, I thought about this. It had rained in the morning and it had cleared off toward noon. And it was the night of our high school homecoming football game. There was a corsage in my refrigerator for my then girlfriend that I would take, put it on her and take her to the ball game that night. And I was in art class, and art class was across noon, so you had 10 minutes of art class, a bell rang, you all went to the cafeteria and ate, and you came back and had 40 minutes of art class afterwards. I was bored that day, and I ate my lunch real fast, and I went back to the art room working on something, and for some reason the radio came on, on the PA, and they never turned the radio on the PA except by mistake, or when they were making announcements for, at homeroom in the morning, right, But it was going on and on. There was just music on, some kind of march music or something like that, right, And then they went to the CBS News feed, and people were talking about President Kennedy being shot. And this is the first anybody had heard of it, right, because everybody's mind was on the homecoming football game, of course, right, And I sit there listening to, I was listening at the same time the newsmen were trying to report it, right, And they didn't know anything more than that the president had been shot and that the car had taken off to Parkland Hospital, right, And then they came on, and it was Cronkite made the announcement on TV, but it was Bob Schaefer who made the announcement on radio, CBS radio. And they said that Kennedy had died at 1 o'clock, right, and stuff, right? And our homecoming football game was, of course, on Tuesday night after the Kennedy funeral, right, on Monday afternoon. The nation just stopped. And the other thing is, I was driving back from where I got my comic books at the time, which was a little grocery store about a mile away from the house, when the radio came on, and Oswald was shot on live radio, right, and stuff, right, and like cars were doing this on the road, right, because they were obviously listening to the radio too, right, and stuff, but like, it was some weekend, let me tell you, right,
Was this, was it Houston, Mississippi?
No, this was in Arlington, Texas.
Oh, you were in Texas
30 miles
Okay.
away from Dallas, of course.
When did you move from Mississippi to Texas?
When I was 4.
Okay.
It was,
So you were hardly in Mississippi, really?
well, yes, except every summer.
Okay.
Every summer, went back every summer for 14 years, I guess, right, till I was 18, right, But, anyway, I was in Arlington, Texas, like, 15, 20 miles from
Just
Dallas.
down the road.
Right? Yeah, that's down the road from Dallas, right,
You mentioned where you bought your comic books, which leads me to my next question. When did your interest in fantastic fiction begin? Did you start out as a comic book fan, or were you reading the short stories as well?
I'd read science fiction on, I'd read everything with an atom or a rocket on it in the library, right, which they had to segregate it out, right, and then when comics fandom was first starting, Buddy Saunders, of course, I was in 7th grade with him, right? I was going to be the world's greatest comic book artist, okay, right? And there's plenty of fanzines out there now, almost surely faded to nothing, right, on Purple Ditto. with covers and art by me in them, right, and stuff. In fact, if you can still find the Rockets Blast Comic Collector Special number 2 on Timely Comics, about half the art in there is by me, right, and stuff. But I was going to be a comic book artist, and I inked, which is, going over the mimeograph pencils, right, to make them, appear, to pick up the mimeograph on the back. You go over them with a pen, and it pushes through and it collects the ink like that. This is all ancient technology to y'all, right? But I inked some pages for Buddy, and he paid me in comic books. And the 2 comic books he paid me in were Amazing Spider-Man #1 and Amazing Spider-Man #1 and Amazing Fantasy #15, which of course now are worth about $50,000 or something. So you could say I worked for comic books, or I worked for $50,000 one afternoon, right? But of course I sold them when they were worth about $38 a piece, because I needed the rent that month, right? And just watch the price go up and up and up, right? Afterwards, right? But I had made, I did the work, and then Buddy gave me the comic books, and they're worth $38 a piece already. And I said, they can't go any higher than this, right?
You mentioned Buddy Saunders 2 or 3 times now, with whom you would later collaborate on Texas-Israeli War.
Yes.
Yeah. But at the same time, your involvement in comics fandom put you in touch with a lot of other writers who had the same interests,
Right.
who weren't in the same town with
Right,
you.
right.
And I'm thinking specifically of the fact that you began corresponding with a young fan named George Martin.
Right, right. The first time, it's a story of our friendship. The first time I ever got anything from George, it was 25 cents for a comic book. I had put an ad in those days. They couldn't give you money for doing stuff in fanzines, but they gave you a free ad, like a quarter-page ad in the fanzine. And I had put that I was selling Brave and Bold #28, which is the first appearance of the Justice League, right? And I got a special delivery letter with 25 cents in it, a quarter, right? From a guy named George Martin in Bayonne, New Jersey, right? So we started corresponding, right? And anyway, we that was 1962, and we wrote letters so long it cost us 6 cents to mail them, as we say, right? It was 4. It went up to 4 in 1963 for the Civil War centennial, but we wrote letters so big we had to put 2 extra penny stamps on them, right?
Did you and George start writing and submitting stories to the magazines about the same time, or were you...
Yeah. This later. That was 62. Later, our first stories were published within. Our first sales were within a month of each other. He sold
1970,
1970. He sold to Galaxy. I sold to Analog.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and my story was delayed for 2 years because I killed John W. Campbell. John W. Campbell bought a story from me and sat at the same desk for 38 years. He bought a story from me and dropped dead. and then Ben Bova took over, but it took about 12 months for everything to settle down. And then Ben Bova wrote me and says, "Can I change the terminology in your story?" And I said, "No, Ben, keep the terminology the same. Make me look like an idiot," right? But I told him, I said, "Sure," right? And stuff. And the story appeared. The story sold 4 days after I was drafted in the U.S. Army, and I was doing push-ups, and they had mail call, and I got the notice that the story had sold. And then I got to celebrate for about 10 seconds and then go back down and do about 100 more push-ups, right?
Which was basically the story of your career.
Yes, the story of my career. But anyway, the story was sold 4 days after I went in the Army, and it appeared the month I got out of the Army. It appeared in the May 1972 issue, right?
I'm assuming that in the interim, you had very little or no time to write at all in that period.
Yeah, I sold my second story the month before I got out of the Army.
Okay.
Right, I sold.
So you did
yeah,
get some writing done.
But it didn't appear. Yeah, I did it, but it didn't appear for 4 more years later too. Right, because first it's going to be in a Dave Gerald anthology, and then the publisher told him to lose half the stories in the anthology and all this stuff, and it was one of them that went out. And then I sold it to somebody else, and then they sold it to somebody else. Right, so it didn't come out till 75 or 76. Right,
One of the first times I met you, I remember hearing you say that you are always careful to sell your story to the lowest bidder.
Well, this is a myth. This is a myth. It only happened once. And I took the low bid because the low bid was a better deal. It would appear somewhere, they wouldn't monkey with it, it would have beautiful art with it, it was going to appear in Shayhall, right?
Yeah.
And the people that were originally going to publish it, it was going to be just another story in a crap anthology or something, right? So I said, I'm going to withdraw that story from you and write another one for you, and then, and then I sold
Remember what story that was?
the one that replaced it.
The one that you actually sold to the lower bidder.
Oh, that was, it wasn't Dr. Hudson's Secret Gorilla, it was the other.
What makes Hieronymus run?
What? No, it wasn't. No, it was the one before that. Oh, well.
Anyway, doesn't matter.
Right.
I was just wondering if it was in Howard Who. Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Right. Okay.
When did you come down from Arlington to this part of the state? I know you spent some time in College Station and some time in Austin. What was the timeline there? Because once you got down around here, you began collaborating with people. Or
Yes.
maybe you did that in Dallas too.
Yes, we started in Dallas because Utley lived in Carrollton. I lived in Arlington. Proctor lived in Arlington. Buddy lived in Arlington. Lisa lived in Austin at the time. Lisa Tuttle lived in Austin at the time. And we started a collaboration. Everything I wrote, I moved to College Station because friends said, "No, come and they had the Monkey House, which was a slam shack, as we called it in the old days. A bunch of science fiction fans in one house." And they said, "We got a vacancy, but we don't want any of the people who want to be here, right? We want you here." And I said, "Okay." So I moved to College Station with my dog, and everything I wrote in college, I was there for 6 months. Everything I wrote in College Station, nothing sold. Absolutely nothing sold. Then I moved to Austin, and everything I had written in College Station sold. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Tell me why, right? The right editors weren't at the right place,
Yeah.
the first time, right? But, yeah, that was 73 and 74. I moved to Austin in 74.
Okay. Well, your move to Austin leads me to my next question. How would you describe the influence of the anthropologist and writer Chad Oliver in your life?
Well, it was tremendous. It's like, people don't believe me. The first real science fiction novel I read growing up, I read all the ones you get, like what's the name of it? The kids' books you read, the Spaceship Under the Apple Tree.
The one with the great inside covers.
Yes, exactly, right. I read all that stuff, but the first real science fiction book I read was Chad's Mists of Dawn in the Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston juvenile series, right? And little knowing that I would grow up and be his fishing buddy 30 years later, right? And stuff, right? But he was tremendous, and like Utley described him as one of the last gentlemen in America, right? Which is really true, right?
When did you actually meet him?
I met him when the Austin Sun, the precursor, but no connection to the Austin Chronicle, sent me to interview him when I first moved here in '74. I'd met him at an Aggie Con in College Station
Okay.
a couple of years before, but they sent me to interview him, right, you know, and I did a piece on him, right, you know, and stuff for the Austin Sun, right, you know.
When did you start fishing with him?
About 1978 or 79, right, something like that.
Had you both been fly fishermen and just discovered that the other had the interest, or did you?
No, it was, I spent 10 hours fishing a day when I was a kid, every day, right, you know. And I did that up until I was about 19 or 20, and then I didn't fish for 10 years. And then I got back into it about 1979, right, you know. And I decided that I would be a fly fisherman, right, you know. And that's what I did. And then, you know, then me and Chad started fishing places, right, you know, together, right, you know.
What can you tell me about your collaborations with Stephen Utley?
Well,
I'm thinking about Custer's Last Jump.
Well,
in
there you go.
particular, Yeah.
the reason to collaborate, people, is we both had our own careers. All the writers I knew that started writing at the same time, we both had our own careers. You work and work and work on the story. You do your best job. You send it off. It comes back. It's rejected. You send it out again. It's rejected. Right. We sat down and did the collaborations, and they sold first time out every time. So we said, this collaborating stuff's pretty good. Why don't we do more of it, right? You know. But the first thing we collaborated on was Custer's Last Jump, right? No, the first thing we collaborated on was the little short thing that was in Famous Monsters. It's called Even the Children Know. And of course, the surprise ending that it's a Frankenstein monster, which Forey Ackerman, of course, destroyed by putting a picture of Karloff.
Completely ruined the surprise.
Completely ruined the surprise of the story, right? You know, and it was delayed because it was supposed to be in the issue in 1973, but it didn't appear in '74 because both Bruce Cabot and Robert Armstrong died on the same day. You know, the two stars of King Kong, right? You know, on the same day, and they needed 2 pages for the in memoriam thing, and so our story was moved up to another issue, right? You know, but anyway, and then we collaborated on Custer's Last Jump, essentially on the phone, as we called each other, you know, playing the game of can you top this? And
Well, you were
read-
living in the same town, weren't you? Or was he
No,
somewhere
he was
else?
in Carrollton and I was in
He was still
Arlington,
in
about
Carrollton.
40 miles
Okay.
away, right, you know? And we just call each other on the phone and read the other guy a couple of paragraphs from the story as we envisioned it. And then the other guy would read his, right, you know? And that's why it reads like it's written like a schizophrenic. Because we wrote it from 2 different points of view. You know, one's a report from the Smithsonian, one is a popular magazine article, and the other one is from Twain's dirigible trip through the West, right, you know? And it was written in 3 completely different styles, right? So that helped, right,
Yeah.
you know, because we could do those separately, right, and then put them all together, right, you know?
I was wondering how that worked because I remember, I'd never actually talked to you or Stephen about how you had done your collaborations, but I remember reading about how C.M. Kornbluth and Fred Pohl collaborated. When they collaborated, they would be in the same house. One guy would type 4 pages and then say, your turn. The other guy would go type 4 pages
Right.
and say, your turn. But you didn't do anything like that.
Not on that story. We did, the other stories we did somewhat like, I mean, we did some of that, right? We collaborated every way you can collaborate, right? Whatever was working for the story is the way we did it, right, you know? But we did like that and Black as a Pit from Pole to Pole, same, you know, we did that mostly
Yeah.
together and sequentially, right, you know?
You were probably living both in Austin by then?
Yeah, both in Austin by then, right, you know, and stuff.
Which I'm required to do, which is to talk about me. You and I met in 1986 for the very first time. I'd been reading you for quite a while before that. I hadn't originally seen your analog story, but I think I'd read almost every story you've done since that early analog story. But we didn't meet till 1986, which was the year Howard Who first came out in hardback, which is a great collection of your early stories up to that point. But what you didn't know at the time when we met in Kansas City at a convention, was that I'd actually seen you in person once before. I and Barb came to the NASPIC, the North American Science Fiction Convention that was held here in Austin in 1985, and what I really wanted to do, most of all at that convention, was go to the Howard Waldrop reading, because you were one of my favorite short story writers. So we went, the room was packed. My memory is that you came in a little bit late, but then you sat down and read one of the greatest stories and one of the greatest readings of a story I'd ever experienced, which was a story called Night of the Cooters. Now, the legend is that the reason you were a little bit late was that you were actually finishing writing the story in the elevator on the way to the reading. Could that possibly have any truth to it?
It had some truth to it. What I did was Pat Cadigan had a room at the convention, and she was on like 2 panels in a row. So I went up to her room to finish the story. And I kept looking at the watch, and it kept getting closer and closer. And there came a point where I had to take off from the room to get down to the reading. And as I was coming down, I was in the elevator, I was finishing up the last 3 or 4 sentences of the story. And then I walked out and into the room and read, right? And that was another thing where Chad and I had been off fishing in Colorado. It had taken us 2 days coming through torrential thunderstorms in the Panhandle to get home. I came home to find my girlfriend at the time was in the hospital for an emergency operation, and that Warren Spector's dog had died that morning, right? And it wasn't a happy day. And then I went to visit my friend in the hospital, and then came back to the house and sat down and started writing the story. And then I went to the convention and borrowed Pat's room and finished the story.
None of us in the audience had any clue that it had been written under those circumstances, because it was perfect. It was one of the most perfect readings, one of the most perfect stories. For those of you who may not know, Night of the Cooters is Howard's story about one of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds cylinders having landed in Texas. And what happens? It's not a good scene for the Martians, to say the least. That leads me to the fact that Night of the Cooters is one of your stories that is now going to be made into a film, is it not?
Yes, it's, okay. I don't want to do the backstory because it's too painful and horrible, but because something couldn't happen, George bought 3 stories by me. George Martin bought 3 stories by me to turn into either movies or TV episodes or something, right? And he got Joe Lansdale to do the screenplay in Night of the Cooters, which I couldn't think of anybody better to do it. And he got Michael Cassett to do The Ugly Chickens, and then he got an American Indian screenwriter he'd worked with on Beauty and the Beast to do Mary Margaret Road Grader. So those 3 are going to be either TV programs or one anthology movie or something within the next year or so.
So Ugly Chickens, Mary Margaret Road Grader, and Night of the Cooters.
Right.
I'm going to do a little bit of selling here, because the Small Beer Press edition of Howard Who, I've got the original hardback, but y'all can have the paperback. This anthology contains both The Ugly Chickens, which is your Nebula Award-winning story, and World Fantasy 2, right?
Right.
And also includes Mary Margaret Road Grader. You have to find Night of the Cooters elsewhere, but it is widely available. Sort of to conclude, I would like to ask if anyone in the audience has a question for Mr. Waldrop.
Howard, did you, I often meant to ask, but I never have, when you did, Heirs of the Perisphere, what did you have to work out with the Disney people was it the Playboy magazine lawyers that had to work something out with?
Nothing. Nothing. If you go back and read the story, there is never a mention of Mickey Mouse or Goofy or Donald Duck anywhere in the story.
Right.
And Brad Holland, who did the illustration for Playboy, has a scene of sand dunes, and over the last sand dune disappearing is a duck and a dog and a mouse, right? But nowhere in the story are any Disney characters mentioned. But there's absolutely no reason anybody reading the story doesn't know that, right? You know what I mean? And it's like the same. Karen Joy Fowler had a great story. The
Faithful Companion 40.
The Faithful Companion at 40. It's a totally feminist story in which the only woman is tied and bound in the corner of the cabin, the whole story. But it's about the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And the publisher she sent it to was so afraid of the Rather Corporation that they refused the story. And Lou Shiner and I went over the story for her, and it's the Lone Ranger, and it's Tonto, and their names are never mentioned anywhere in the story. And she sent it back to him, and he said, well, yeah, we can publish this, right, and stuff. So they did, right, but there's no doubt in there who they are. But it was for in both cases, like I said, if Disney had come to me and says, you're using one of our characters. I said, well, you haven't used them in 40 years. Why should you worry, right? But that didn't happen in either case, right?
You just reminded me of another story in Howard Who, Save a Place in the Lifeboat for Me.
Yes.
In which you use characters who, for anyone who is paying attention, Buddy Holly, the Marx Brothers, and various others, but you never mentioned them by name.
No.
Yeah. This is how you get away with a lot of
This is
stuff.
how you get away with a lot of stuff. It's like, Disney has become litigious, a lot more litigious since Heirs of the Perisphere was published.
Yeah.
You probably couldn't publish that today without getting some chaff from them, right? But I wrote it then, and, they can live with it, right? Because they didn't prosecute me in the first 5 years, right?
Any more questions? Because I have one more.
Oh.
Yeah.
Would you be so kind as to divulge what your favorite fishing spot in Texas might be?
It's according to what you're fishing for. I'll tell you a little known secret since I don't live there anymore. For the few months I lived in Fort Worth after I came back from Washington State, Benbrook Lake is the best white bass fishing lake in Texas. And most people don't know that, right? It's really good for white bass, which I'd never fished for specifically before I moved there, right? That's just general, right? You'll have to find them in the lake itself, but the lake is start with the lake, right?
Step one, find the water.
Find the water. Right? Step two, right? No.
Anyone else? Anything? That was a good one. I like that question.
Right.
All right, final question. What can you tell us about ortolans?
Okay, ortolans, as those of you who are in the know, ortolans are a small bird of passage which comes through France once a year. The chefs go crazy. They send out bird catchers to catch them. You take the ortolans, you bring them to the place, you take the ortolans and you crush them in a big press, right? And then you serve them on a bed of toast usually, to people, and the experience is so delightful to them of eating an ortolan that they put their napkins over their heads so that people can't see them enjoying the ortolans. I told this to some people at a convention once, and not a goddamn soul in the place believed me. They thought I had made this up. And then, of course,
A week later,
A week later.
one of us is flipping through the newspaper, and there's a picture of a woman in France with a towel over her head, eating a bird. I'm like, well, shit.
nobody,
We have to believe everything Howard tells us forever from now on.
It's vindicated.
nobody believed me. It's true.
So you do make shit up for a living.
That's why we didn't believe you. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Howard Waldrop.